start recording. There we go. And welcome everyone to our July edition of our online talks. Very kindly being delivered by Richard Oram of the University of Stirling. I'm very excited by this particular talk because it's talking about the reuse of architectural elements in later medieval Scotland. Scotland is such a rich country with its castle culture, and especially in the later Middle Ages as well. It's one of those things where you can spend an entire lifetime learning about the subjects within castle studies. So it should be an absolute delight. And I'm always interested as well in how architectural elements are reused to bolster people's power and authority. So it's a fascinating topic. And with that, I think it's now time to get stuck in to the talk itself. A reminder for our audience that we'll be having questions at the end, so do hold on to those and we'll make use of the chat at the end of the talk. So, Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Now, unusually, for those of you who know me, I don't normally like to read a scripted paper, but there's so much I'm trying to pack in here. So bear with me if I sound a bit more stilted than usual. Anyway, I should now be sharing my screen. Yes?
Yep, so it's full screen.
Excellent. There we go. Okay, now, in common with their counterparts across Europe, Scotland's noble families placed great store on their blood and status, the antiquity of their lineage, and their possession of the cultural trappings that proclaimed lineal continuity and deep connection between them and the land from which their power was derived. Now, those cultural trappings were rich and varied. They included things like prose or poetic narratives that traced their ancestry to often mythical progenitors. There's also artifacts like weaponry, jewels, or table vessels, which link their owners with a proud and martial past, like the Butte Mazer here on your screen. Mausolea too were rich with monuments and other visible indications of long presence in their sculptural details, heraldry, or the vestments, altar equipment, and books liberally decorated with the family arms. But of course, the greatest symbols were the castles that formed their chief residences. Indeed, into the early 17th century, the lordly symbolism of the castle in Scotland, especially the turreted tower, which proclaimed the jurisdictional powers of Scottish barons, was paramount in signalling the extent and nature of their authority, and importantly, through that signal, advertising the noble heritage of the building's owner. Family dignity, ancestry, and nobility were all bound up in the maintenance of the building's visual indicators of antiquity and status. Now, appeals to antiquity or the appropriations of its trappings, whether inherited lineally or acquired, became more important in statements of nobility in the later Middle Ages. The well-known 14th century example of the construction of the residential Guy and Caesar's Tower at Warwick Castle in England by the Beauchamp family, with names harking back to a semi-mythical heroic ancestor of the castle's builders and to one of the greatest heroes of antiquity, is a manifestation of this trend at the apex of the social elite. The naming of towers in this way is less common in Scotland, possibly due to the extinction of many magnate families in the course of the Wars of Independence, or the forfeitures of the second and third quarters of the 15th century, which severed the lineal connections between contemporary owners of castles and their original builders. Where it was the antiquity of the building rather than the direct connection with its founders that mattered, the name of disgraced or extinct families might be preserved, perhaps especially because of their former greatness. This is the case at Blair Athol in Perthshire, for example, where the early 16th century Stuart Earls of Athol preserved a memory of their castle's 13th century Cummin of Badenoch builders by labelling part of their residence Cummings Tower. This association with the family who had once been the greatest power in Central Highland Scotland reflects the Athol Stuart's ambitions to replicate that regional dominance. Like the Beauchamps at Warwick, the Athol Stewarts were at the apex of the noble hierarchy, being cousins of the kings of Scots, but they had only gained their earldom in the 1450s. They were quasi-royal, but regionally arriviste. For them, appropriation of a much older site was a means of cementing their position within the regional network of lordship and proclaiming their intention to exercise that lordship in the manner of their non-lineal antecessors. For those without the cachet of royal kinship, other mechanisms were employed. Upwardly mobile families sought to preserve physical indicators of deep ancestral connection with a site or kin relationship with a family of greater social status who had once held a property. For those with no such blood connection, the straightforward appropriation of the physical representation of an ancient family's power provided a mechanism for the annexation of the reputation and position of the old owners by the new. For my first example, the Ruthvens or Ruthvens, the decision was to retain portions of a structure that proclaimed their unbroken descent in the male line from their caput 12th century owners. The residence, Ruthven near Perth, is better known as Huntingtower, since the Ruthven's forfeiture by King James VI in 1600 and his prescription of the family name. When first described in surviving records in the 15th century, it is as a manerium rather than a castle. The family's territorially derived surname reveals a well-established and chronologically deep bond with a significant landed estate that was centred on their residence just to the south of the River Amond, west of the borough of Perth. The Ruthvens had long established regional connections, having been prominent in East Perthshire and the earldom of Strathearn from at least the second half of the 12th century. They had strong connections within their locality too, being prominent barons, patrons of the parish church at Tibermore, just over 2 kilometres southwest of the castle. In the early 1500s, they founded and endowed 3 altars and chaplainries there, creating an embryonic collegiate foundation that in itself was an indication of their social elevation, self-identification with the surrounding land, and wish to celebrate their lineal connection through the physical presence of ancestral tombs within a purpose-built chantry foundation. Pride in this deep ancestry and ancient territorial connection was reflected in the 15th century gate tower of the Manerium that they retained through extensive later rebuildings. The Ruthvens Manor House survives as 2 distinct towers linked awkwardly by a later infilling of the narrow gap, only 3 metres wide, which separated them. Roof scars, tusking and raggles on the north facade and east gable of the surviving composite structure reveal that it formed part of an extensive complex ranged round a courtyard that was bounded on the north by the steep escarpment, dropping precipitously to the former floodplain of the River Amond 15 metres below. Extensive post-medieval landscaping and the absence of invasive archaeological investigation offers little sense of its form between the 12th and early 16th centuries. The slight headland which it occupies perhaps invited early occupation of the site, but there is no visible evidence for earthworks defining an enclosure and nothing to suggest the presence of a motte before construction of the earliest surviving stone buildings around 1400. And those are the lighter stonework sections in the tower on the right-hand side of the photograph as you're looking towards it there. So that eastern tower contains the older fabric of the 2, the lower stages of its south front and east gable being the only upstanding survival of this pre-1500 stone-built phase. Its finely dressed greyish-pink ashlar contrasts with the ruddy brown stone of its upper stages and of the western tower. The exact date of the eastern tower is uncertain, but could be very late 14th or very early 15th century, from the form of one surviving ground floor slit window. The finish of the slightly ogee-headed aperture in the middle of the shot there, slightly ogee-headed aperture is very fine, pointing to a building of quality. The lower courses of the chamfer jambs of a wide gateway that you can see in the section just along to the right at the far end there, you can see where an early 20th century Office of Works clearance has exposed them. They're still visible at the eastern end of the tower's south side, and an infilled round-headed archway survives on the north side. These mark the locations of an entranceway to the manor house, leading through a barrel-vaulted pend into a courtyard to the north. Here's the remnant of the pend. You can see the intern of the barrel vault in the gable wall, with a later inserted barrel vault running in the opposite direction over the top of it. A blocked first floor doorway in the east gable bears no relationship to a later single-storey building abutting against this side, whose roof raggle cuts across its lower courses. It apparently provided access to a parapet walk on a low enclosure wall running east from the gatehouse, but no trace of a bonded junction between gable and curtain is detectable. With no archaeological investigation to determine the nature of the enclosure, we can only speculate that either its stonework simply butted against the gatehouse or it was timber built. The pend occupied roughly the eastern third of the tower, the western portion probably containing a porter's lodge and storage. Perhaps this gate structure publicised the jurisdictional powers of its Ruthven lord, possibly with heraldic displays as visible indicators of those powers and their source. All the heraldry at the castle was eradicated after the 1600 prescription. It was perhaps for that reason, this need to display their status and for the continuity of the Ruthvens' deep ancestral connection with their residents, that it was absorbed into a tower built for the first Lord Ruthven. Ruthven's Tower was one part of a radical reconfiguration of the residential arrangements. We do not know how more extensive his building work was, for the east, west and northern quarters of the courtyard behind were demolished in the 18th century. From what does survive, a single operation commencing circa 1500 saw the reconfiguration of the southern mass of the complex. And you can see the phasing here, the black representing the 15th century work, and the left to right diagonally hatched, representing the early 15th century work. This is the Historic Environment Scotland phased plan. So from what does survive, as I say, a single operation commencing about 1500 saw the reconfiguration of the southern mass of the complex. Its two most obvious developments were the transformation of the old gatehouse into a residential tower and the construction of a second tower immediately to its west, between which probably lay the new principal gateway. When the entrance was repositioned, the north and west walls of the gatehouse were taken down and a doorway into the new tower inserted towards the west end of the rebuilt north wall. The old pend was removed in the same operation to create a single large space in the tower's ground floor, at first with a timber ceiling above, but replaced shortly afterwards by a barrow vault. The surviving extent of the distinctive ashlar of this first phase extends to just above ceiling level of the current first floor chamber, indicating that the gatehouse had been of at least 2 stories in its pre-1500 form. The only certain 15th century details of the upper floor of the gatehouse is the eastern jamb of a small window at its western end and the blocked doorway in the east gable mentioned above. Internally, the new tower provided high quality accommodation on 2 levels over the basement, with probable servants' accommodation in a garret. 17th century alterations have transformed the original arrangements, but access to the first floor was from a straight stair rising in the new west wall that then turned into a spiral in thickness of the northwest angle. An inverted keyhole gun loop, sorry if you'd put that one up to show the north face of it, and there's the interior arrangements. An inverted keyhole gun loop of a form in vogue circa 1500 opens from a straight section of stair facing across the gap to the western tower. The first floor space, entered directly from the first turn of the spiral stair, and this is on your screen at the moment, is labelled traditionally as the hall, but was the lower of 2 chambers. No evidence survives for a screen's passage, although the arrangement of windows in the south wall allows for a narrow space to the west, lit by a small window from the pre-1500 gatehouse. There was a latrine closet in the thickness of the southwest angle opening off this putative screen's passage. The chamber had a large fireplace in the centre of the new north wall and was lit by windows in the south, with no direct access to a kitchen No arrangements for food preparation for the table and no slop drain, but with high quality fireplace and latrine provision, this was not a dining room, but reception space where Ruthvens Lord met important visitors. The second floor chamber, sorry, that is what's now on screen. The second floor chamber, accessible only from the spiral stair, was family space and bedroom. Provided with a fine fireplace of circa 1500 in its east wall, flanked by windows with seats in the ingles to north and south, it is a room that combines comfort with display. A latrine closet at the southwest angle and generous provision of 3 ombres for storage confirm this as the accommodation of a man of status and wealth. The closing up of the early gate pend and heightening of the gatehouse into a substantial residential tower was roughly contemporary with the construction of the second tower just 3 meters to its west. Context for this novel development has been suggested in a partition in 1480 of the Ruthven estate between William and John, the legitimised sons of Sir William Ruthven of that ilk, with the brothers being provided with accommodation for their separate households. This suggestion, however, is mistaken, for no such partition occurred between William and John, but rather a settlement of the properties by the father on the elder of his 2 sons. The legitimation of the brothers, they were offspring of Sir William's long premarital relationship with Isabella Levington, was confirmed by royal letters dated 2 July 1480, which were followed 10 days later by the elder William's resignation of his lands to William Jr., reserving his own free tenement. If construction of the Western Tower related to that arrangement, it was to provide father and son with suites of accommodation appropriate to their status. But the architectural details of the remodeled East Tower and the new West Tower point to a date closer to 1500. The trigger for the building was then perhaps the elevation of the elder William to a Lordship of Parliament as Lord Ruthven by King James III on the 29th of January 1488. Which led to plans for a suitably impressive residence to reflect the new status of the family's head. Construction of a new building was delayed by the rebellion in the summer of 1488 by the heir to the throne, the future James IV. The rebellion saw the death of James III at the hands of his son's supporters, Lord Ruthven's imprisonment as a creature of the dead king, and his rehabilitation on the payment of a very substantial fine that burdened him with debt for many years. It is likely then that work on the enlarged complex was beginning to be advanced by July 1497 only, when King James IV confirmed the elder William's settlement of the hereditary office of Sheriff of Perth on his son. By then, William Jr. was fully adult, married with a growing family, and as sheriff, maintaining a household of his own. It was probably to accommodate that separate organism within the wider Ruthven household that he built the new tower, which is on the left of the image here. Surviving inverted keyhole gun loops in the Western Tower's basement indicate construction contemporaneously with the remodelling of the East Tower. It is bulkier in plan than his father's accommodation, but slightly lower in height. It is a stepped L with a rectangular main block and a square jamb at its southwest angle, which rises 1 story higher than the main compartment. The principal entry is now at first floor level through the north gable of the main block, but it was originally similar to the Eastern Tower in having a straight stair from ground to first floor. No trace of any communication between the basement rooms and the first floor is now visible. Blocked up doorways in the east wall, facing into the 3-meter gap between the towers, provided access to 2 rooms beneath the main block, with access from the southern room into the basement of the jamb. Current interpretation labels the first floor room of this tower also as a hall, but is more correctly a chamber. Later alterations have transformed the appearance of this space, sweeping away the fireplace and enlarging its windows, but one surviving original east-facing window indicates a well-lit room. A later 16th century spiral, a later 16th century spiral stair to the upper floors now rises at the northwest angle of the main block, entered from the ingo of the north gable door, and is accommodated partly in a clumsily contrived curved external swelling, which appears to mark a remodelling of this corner made soon after its original construction. There is a latrine closet in the west wall, entered from what might have been a screen's passage that separated this service end of the room from the rest. The high end was originally at the south, where a doorway leads into the smaller room in the southwest jamb and to a privy placed in the re-entrant angle between the jamb and the main block. The second floor has the same arrangement with single original access point from the northwestern spiral stair, latrine closet at the northwest of the main chamber, but this time no latrine in the southwest jamb room. It is likely that this was the bed chamber, possibly with accommodation for daughters in the inner space of the southwestern jamb, furthest from the access point. Finally, the main block was topped by a garret room within the parrot walk, while the jamb was carried up 1 story higher. Now, what is striking about both towers is the absence of any service provision within either of them. Neither contains a kitchen nor easy access to water. There is too no public ceremonial space in either building, and it is likely that there was a pre-1500 hall and kitchen block elsewhere in the complex, perhaps on its west side, where the later 16th century hall or gallery block that ran north from the western tower later stood. While that is just speculation in the absence of geophysical or excavational evidence, we do have some documentary evidence for a more substantial group of early buildings within the enclosure, in the reference to a chapel dedicated to St. Peter, in which William Lord Ruthven established a perpetual chaplainry in June 1509. There is no evident chapel or oratory anywhere in the surviving structure. Even in its current truncated form, we can see that Ruthven married the fabric of his inherited manor house with that of his new work. He absorbed the old gatehouse that symbolised the jurisdictional authority and lordly status of his ancestors into the new tower that proclaimed his own socially elevated dignity, and constructed alongside it a new tower for his heir in a visually bold declaration of the continuity of his lineage into the future. My second example dates from a generation after Ruthven's enlargement and was undertaken for different reasons, but with a similar purposeful declaration of continuity underlying it. At East Wemyss on the Fife coast, the locally arriviste Lord Sir James Colville of Ochiltree, comptroller of the household of King James V, a leading judge in the College of Justice and head of a family of ancient but purely Ayrshire significance, marked his acquisition of this eastern barony with a major building programme at his new caput. Colville had East Wemyss through an exchange in 1530 with Sir James Hamilton of Thinart, whose wife, Mary Livingston of Drumry, was Lady of East Wemyss in her own right. It was a mutually beneficial exchange in straight economic terms. Hamilton, whose principal estates were in Lanarkshire and Ayrshire, received Colville's ancestral estates in the west, while Colville received East Wemyss with its coal mines and salt pans and the Livingstons' other properties in Fife. Colville, however, had given up an estate and castle associated with his family for centuries and gained a new property with which neither he nor his kin had any link. At its heart, however, stood a substantial building with very ancient origins, known today as MacDuff's Castle. A manor of Wemyss already existed by 1306 when the English king Edward I ordered its burning. It was rebuilt before about 1332 when the manor place of Wemyss was named in a charter of Michael, Lord of Wemyss, as the caput where his vassals were to pay him service. A lordly residence on this site may have had much earlier origins, possibly as a property associated with Macduff's Earl of Fife, who retained superiority over the Lordship of Wemyss until the annexation of their earldom to the crown in 1425. Nothing of any early complex can be identified with confidence, and this is the early 1920s Royal Commission on the Ancient Historical Monuments of Scotland plan, showing the phasing that they proposed. The most important component of the 14th century manor house to survive, incorporated into the residence acquired by the Colvilles, was, as at Ruthven, a rectangular gate tower of the late 14th century, down there the bottom left of your view. A rectangular gate tower of the late 14th century, modified to form the main residential block of the complex in the 15th century. It is uncertain when the gate tower, which is there on the left in your view, was first erected. But its likely builders, the Livingstons, held the estate since division of the greater lordship of Weems through the failure in the male line and partition of the heritage between three heiresses in the mid-1300s. The late 14th century tower may have been part of a building operation intended to place the mark of the new Livingston owners on their heritage. The traditional assumption is that it was a completely new castle built by one of the two younger heiresses, the eldest supposedly inheriting West Weems, where her descendants, who readopted the designation de Weems as their surname, possibly built a new caput. It is nowhere explicit in the surviving records, but it seems rather that the Livingstons were the senior branch of the family and the West Weems branch descended from a younger sister. The Livingstons, as the senior heirs, gained possession of the ancestral caput and the symbolic lordship that it represented. Just a more detailed view there. The full extent of what Colville found at East Weems is unknown, but its chief component was the rectangular tower that his Livingston predecessors had developed from the 14th century gatehouse on the left there. It measured approximately 10.7 meters by 8.5 externally, with walls 1.7 meters thick, built of coarse sandstone rubble with pinnings, and appeared similar to the early 15th century work at Riven. This, referred to as the North Tower, was demolished in the 1960s and survives only as an overgrown rubble mound. Fortunately, McGibbon and Ross had recorded it in the 1880s and Arkham surveyed it in 1927. From those accounts and from early engravings and photographs such as this, it's possible to work out the external appearance and much of the layout of the interior of the loft structure. Like at Huntingtower, the Livingstons' tower stood at the edge of the principal enclosure, which here extends seawards to the east, and originally contained the main gateway in its northern half at basement level. It led into a barrel-vaulted pen, 2.75 meters wide, running east-west in its northern half at basement level. It led into a barrel-vaulted pen that led into the courtyard behind. The gate was probably blocked in the 15th century rather than the 16th century modelling as suggested by Arkhams, and the inner archway was then reduced to a small door into a cellar that was formed in the old pen. The southern half of the basement comprised originally a barrel-vaulted guardroom or porter's lodge, which then became just storage. There was no communication between pend or guardroom and the tower above, which was reached originally via an external stair to a door at first floor level in its south wall. Around 1500, a new entrance was inserted in the east side through an older window embrasure, again reached via an external stair. Sorry, back we go. That's the large gap that you can see at the bottom of the tower on the left there. That's the circa 1500s doorway. The second entrance may have been part of a wider remodelling, possibly involving a heightening of the structure, which required new access arrangements to the upper floors. Still in the 16th century, a spiral stair in a square stair tower was constructed against the angle north of the secondary entrance, providing access to the upper floors and parapet walk. And you can see that addition on the extreme left of the tower there. The new stair probably replaced an earlier one that began as a straight flight rising in the thickness of the east wall at the southeast angle, which was reached by a short passage within the ingo to the right of the main entrance passage. Like several Eastern Scottish great towers of this period, the remodelled 15th century first floor rose into a high barrel vault with a timber entresol carried on massive corbels set into the haunch of the vault. The greatest similarity at this stage in the tower's vertical arrangement is with the main block of the much larger and ill-planned late 14th century tower at Craigmillar in Edinburgh. At East Weems, the lower of these two spaces was a fine room in its late 14th century form, originally with a fireplace in its west wall, Ombry in its south wall, and large window with window seat, later converted into the new entrance in its east courtyard-facing side. The Royal Commission suggested that this room was converted into a kitchen in the 15th century, possibly due to the presence of an Ombry and stone sink inserted into an older garderobe closet in the north wall. But the large window embrasures with seats suggest a more residential function continuing through the 16th century. If this represented a modification of the late 14th century arrangements, the level over the original gateway contained a good quality residential space, possibly the principal accommodation of the mid-14th century Weems lords or their Livingston heirs. The upper floors of the tower were accessed at least from the 15th century modelling via the stair at the southeast, which at this point turned into a spiral in the thickness of the angle. The entresol beneath the vault was lit only by slits high in its north and south walls. It lacked any provision for residential use and was perhaps utilised for storage as at Craigmillar. Above the vault was at least one and probably two further levels, apparently with single rooms on each floor. It is likely that these were bedchambers. An angled inset of the tower's walls marks the transition between the vault and upper floors, almost the only decorative feature on its otherwise smooth vertical faces. 19th and early 20th century photographs show the one surviving upper level at that date as lit by a large window within a high embrasure in the east wall, with a second embrasure blocked by the later stair tower at the northeast angle, between which an entrance from the 16th century stair had been cut through, and the jamb of a third window in the largely fallen west wall. Joist holes above the eastern embrasure arch indicate that there was a further floor above, possibly a garret within a parapet, but it had been long demolished before the earliest surviving visual records of the castle were drawn in the 1830s. No evidence survives at the time of any of the existing visual records of the buildings for the form of the wallhead. The Livingston family then had built a residential structure of good quality. Its coarse masonry rather than random rubble work indicating the cost expended on its construction. Through the 15th century, they added to the layout of an adjoining courtyard east and south of the tower that dropped in two terraces to the cliff edge overlooking the shore below. Amongst its component elements was a hall mentioned in 1425, but the relationship of that building to the residential tower is unknown. Only fragments of the enclosures are now visible, and there is no coherent evidence for the wider disposition of buildings within the large enclosure formed by the courtyard walls. Given the fact that the tower seemed only to have contained a reception chamber at first floor level and a great chamber on its upper floor, it is likely that the 1425 hall lay in a separate hall and kitchen block, probably swept away in the Colvilles redevelopment of the castle. For all its evident high quality, the Livingston's castle was inadequate for the needs of Sir James Colville, either as a reflection of his social status or as accommodation for his extended household as required by the changed social manners of the earlier 16th century. So, soon after gaining possession, Colville embarked upon an ambitious programme that transformed the late medieval complex into an imposing great house of early Scottish Renaissance form. It extended along the whole of the west side of the earlier courtyard and possibly along its south too, with additional outer courts to its north and eventually a new outer enclosure wall just a short distance to the west of the main block. The dominant element of this new work is the principal surviving feature of the castle ruins. Almost 20 metres due south of the Livingston's tower, he constructed a new 5-storey tower of high quality sandstone ashlar. The tower measures 8.5 metres north-south by 10.6 metres east-west, with an imposing cylindrical stair turret projecting at its northeast angle. This turret, lit by short slits with broad external chamfers and decorated with boldly projecting string courses at each floor level, contained the new principal residence to the castle's main suite of rooms via a finely moulded door at courtyard level. You can only see the sill at the bottom of the photograph there. A void in the wall face directly over the doorway once held an armorial panel, probably that bearing the Colville coat of arms that was founded during consolidation work in 1906 and which is now preserved at Weems Castle. The stair rose the full height of the tower, providing access at each level into the spacious accommodation it contained, each storey also being accessed via a spiral service stair in the thickness of the tower's northwest angle. In form, it is very similar to the surviving stair turret of Abbot Robert Reid's residence at Kinloss Abbey in Murray, which, like the Colville's new tower at East Weems, was erected in the mid-1530s. Internally, Colville's tower had 4 levels of accommodation over a vaulted basement, which may have contained the kitchen, the great chimney flue of which perhaps rose in the thickness of the now fallen south wall. A drawing from 1838 and late 19th century photographs show the south facade intact. with two large windows at first, second and third floor levels flanking a broad vertical band of masonry that perhaps contained the chimney flue. The first and second stories had a partition wall running north-south, forming two equal-sized rooms on both floors, the eastern ones having doors to the principal stair and provided with a good-sized fireplace in their eastern wall, and the western rooms having access from the service stair, fireplaces and ombres in their western wall. The third floor was a single large space with a fireplace in its north and is the only room to have an east-facing window. Above this are the fragmentary remains of a garret room with gable walls to the north and south rising within a now destroyed parapet walk. This new tower was not freestanding. Doorways in the north wall of its first and second stories opened into a three-story range that linked it with the Livingston's Tower. The east and west parapet walks of this block were reached by doorways from the main stair turret and the service stair positioned to either side of the high-angled drip mould which formed the roof of the range. A similar angled scar cut into the south face of the North Tower, visible in old photographs, shows that the roof continued at the same height along the linking block. This range contained a new main gate which led through a pend into the courtyard beneath the first floor hall, or as Charles McKean suggested, a gallery. No early images survive of the superstructure of the linking block above the cellars and entrance pend, but the visible roofline of the tower's north side shows the height of the demolished building. The vestigial traces of the western parapet against the south tower reveal a broad and architecturally embellished feature, probably of ashlar work rising above an enriched band of decorative false machicolation. The only evidence for the wider physical form of the range, however, is the stump of its east wall where it connects with the stair turret of the south tower. Here survives one jamb of a tall window, decorated with rich mouldings on its outer side and with sockets for glazing bars on the reveal. The reveal is shallowly splayed and rises into the remnants of an arched embrasure, of which only the springer survives. The height of the window suggests a room of quality, as we said, probably the hall or gallery. The position of this large room, its axial form and relationship with the kitchens supports that identification. From what survives, it is probable that the hall's low end lay to the south, adjacent to the kitchen in the south tower's basement. The old north tower, therefore, formed a chamber of dais and inner private suite accessed from its high end. It was an arrangement that conformed with current fashions in Scotland, as reflected in contemporary new builds like Melgund and Angus, where family accommodation occupied a tower west of the hall and secondary accommodation was provided in a separate suite to the hall's east. As at Riven, the question is why it was important to retain the older fabric. At MacDuff's castle, that being despite the manifest inconvenience of its internal arrangements for early 16th century elite living. In both cases, not only was the old tower enlarged or retained, but they also continued to house the private accommodation of the castle's lord. Colville built a new tower at the south end of his hall range, containing comfortable two-room apartments. Their location, however, close to the main door into the castle's principal block, above the kitchen and accessing the hall at its low end, suggests that its accommodation was for guests, household officers, or perhaps as married children. The enlarged complex was visually striking, becoming almost symmetrical to either side of its new gate, a visual aspect further emphasized later in the 16th century when the outer western wall was constructed, for its approach road and gate were aligned with the main gate behind. To visitors, both towers presented an almost windowless mass, and there seems to be a conscious antiquarianism in the design of the ensemble. Indeed, there is a striking similarity to Tantallon Castle in East Lothian, the mid-14th century fortress of Colville's political associate, Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, with its flanking family and lodging towers and centrally positioned gate. Like Lord Ruthvens' towers, however, perhaps the primary motivation for retaining the earlier fabric was the potent display of continuity that it presented, but in this case for a man who had no prior link with the barony he had acquired through exchange. Unlike Lord Ruthven, with his centuries-old lineal connection with his caput, or Hamilton of Finnart, who had gained East Weems through his Livingston wife, Colville had no former association with his Fife barony and lacked any other great house to form the caput to which his titles attached. Local residents and members of the wider political community of South East Fife would have recognised Colvilles' incorporation of the Livingston's Tower into his enlarged house as an appropriation of the lordly symbolism of the old building and his assumption of the power, authority and depth of antiquity for his titles, which its ancient stonework and old-fashioned aspect represented. In my final example, Tolquhon in Aberdeenshire, a similar retention of the acquired status symbols of an anciently established and important local lineage can also be seen in a later 16th century context. Tolquhon today is a magnificent ruin in the care of Historic Environment Scotland, roofless but mostly complete to its wallheads, and standing amidst a complex of outer closes and gardens. Most of the central structure, a quadrangle ranged round an inner court, was erected in the 1580s for William Forbes, but includes at its northeast angle to the left in that view there, the remains of an early 15th century tower attributed to Tolquhon's previous Preston owners. Unlike the arriviste Colvilles in Fife, the Forbeses in this case were hardly newcomers, having acquired Tolquhon through marriage to Mariotta Preston in 1420. On the death of her father, Sir Henry Preston, she had acquired half of the barony of Formartin, which had its caput at nearby Fyvie. The caput passed to her elder sister, and it is possible that Mariotta had gained possession of a subsidiary castle that perhaps had served as the administrative hub for the eastern portion of the widely dispersed Formartine properties. Although traditionally ascribed to Mariotta and her second husband, John Forbes, it is possible that the structure known by the 1580s as the Auld Tour and labelled since at least the early 18th century as Preston's Tower was erected in the late 14th century by Mariotta's father. Certainly, its simple rectangular form and massive construction appears closer to 14th century northeastern Scottish towers like Balvenie, Drum or Hall Forest than to the more sophisticated structures being erected by the 1420s like the old tower at Huntly. The granite rubble construction of Tolquhon's old tower, however, contains no more precisely datable stylistic indications of its approximate age beyond the 5 surviving corbels that once supported a roundel on the parapet walk at its wallhead on the northwest angle. The simple step form of the corbels can be dated no closer than late 14th to early 15th century. During clearance of the rubble from the collapsed south and west walls of the tower in 1936, the Office of Works workmen recovered an armorial panel with the Forbes arms, perhaps formerly set over the tower's door. Douglas Simpson in 1938 linked the arms with William Forbes, 5th Laird of Tolquhon, who succeeded in 1509, but more recent publications view the arms as being those of the first John Forbes. We cannot know if the panel was an original feature of Preston's Tower or an insertion of the 1420s to mark John's acquisition of the castle. We have no surviving visible evidence for the form of the wider complex that accompanied the old tower, although record evidence from 1536 speaks of the tower and fortalice, indicating the existence of an enclosed courtyard adjacent to the tower. Like Riven and East Weems, Tolquhon's tower contained residential accommodation from first floor, and the main room at that level was a chamber with a fireplace, flanked by window embrasures with stone seats, as you can see here. It is likely that a hall and kitchen arrangement adjoined the tower with additional accommodation, service buildings and storage arranged around the courtyard. All of that was swept away in the 1580s to leave just the old tower, when in 1584 William Forbes started what an inscription on his new Châtelet-style gatehouse described as his new work. The principal focus of William's new residence was the South Range, with its actually placed central cylindrical stair tower, which faced visitors as they emerged through the entrance pen. This range contained the principal apartments on 2 main levels, with cellars below and garret rooms above. The new West Range comprised largely of a gallery at first floor level with brewhouse below, culminating in a cylindrical tower that projected boldly from the northwest angle of the quadrangle. That tower contained well-apportioned rooms on 3 levels over the basement, probably providing guest accommodation. The North Range running east from the gallery contained the gatehouse, as already mentioned, with another gallery at first floor level. The gateway proper opened between two mock-fortified turrets akin to the early 16th century chatelettes of the royal palaces at Linlithgow and Stirling, or the entrance facade of Rowallan in Ayrshire. To the right of the gate is the above-mentioned inscription, and over the gate arch a panel with William Forbes' arms, and above that, in symbolic declaration of his status as a royal tenant-in-chief, the Royal Arms of Scotland. Immediately to the east of the gatehouse rises the remains of Preston's Tower, which originally dominated the entire ensemble of House, Tour and Place, as Forbes described his newly finished mansion in 1589. Now, for all the conspicuous display of wealth and status manifest in his work at Tolquhon, and despite his standing as a crown tenant, William Forbes was not a magnate. Indeed, he headed a cadet line of the many-branched Forbes family and was overshadowed locally and regionally by his own kinsmen and several families of more elevated rank, principally the Keith Earls Marshall, the Hay Earls of Errol, and his Preston ancestress's own senior kin, the Meldrums at Fyvie. Here, as at Ruthven, the aim was to use the Auld Tour as a visible indicator of his lineage's antiquity and ancient connection with Tolquhon, its battlemented and turreted wallhead proclaiming their nobility, status, and jurisdictional powers. Made redundant as the principal residential suite of the castle by the modern apartments in the South Range, its preservation is linked directly to its symbolic value rather than its functional potential. As the uselessness of the modern defensive features of the gatehouse underscore, it is not the Auld Tour's inherent strength that commended it to William Forbes, but the direct link to the first Forbes laird, and through him with the Prestons that it represented. It was for that reason that it was identified as Preston's Tour, despite its possible construction for John Forbes. To conclude then, the three castles explored above exemplify a Scottish architectural device employed to reinforce the aristocratic credentials of castle owners. Retention of ancient structures that embodied their social elevation and jurisdictional authority provided the added lustre of deep antiquity and distinguished lineage to their obvious contemporary displays of wealth and power. Through identification with ancient ownership, whether direct or indirect, later owners appropriated the status-enhancing reputation of their predecessors, often stressing their claim to the local and regional authority of those families. In all cases, the emphasis was on continuity and the inheritance of the symbolic apparatus of power that the ancient towers broadcast. Names, as in Preston's Tower at Tolquhon, might be applied to give deeper antiquity, but the key factor was simply the reputation of the ancient builders that the new owners sought to annex. At Ruthven, William Lord Ruthven saw that reputation as embedded within the stones of his ancestral home. Combining its fabric into the new residence he built provided unbroken continuity from the 12th century. In Tolquhon's Auld Tour, William Forbes broadcast his unbroken descent from John Forbes in 1420 and through John's wife Mariotta Preston to a heritage stretching back into the 14th century. Preston's Tower may have been built by the first Forbes laird, but its invented name gave greater social cachet and linked the new house to the ancient administrative seat of the Formartin Thanage. For the Colvilles at MacDuff, despite their lack of any blood or even new marital connection to the former Livingston owners, the old tower provided a physical link through the heirs of the 13th and 14th century Wemyss owners back to one of the most distinguished noble families of earlier medieval Scotland, the MacDuff Earls of Fife. In almost every case, the towers, therefore, constituted an embodiment of nobility in which antiquity, lineage, and status were almost literally written in their stonework. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll stop the recording there.